Hi, everyone. Coach Anna here, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Ballerstedt, and he is a forage agronomist. Now, I think that some of my viewers are actually going to know what that is because we're an agricultural state and we're the beef state. But
Hey.
before you go on and do a presentation, Peter, could you please explain what that is?
Sure. I'm trying to get back to the screen here so I can see who I'm talking to. Well, that's part of the presentation that's coming up, but basically agronomy is that branch of agricultural sciences that includes things like soil and plant sciences. And obviously we're concerned about agricultural uses and therefore food production. My other hat is a forage agronomist. So that's the production of plants that are going to be consumed by animals, either as hay or pasture. And then as a ruminant nutritionist, I'm concerned about the proper feeding of cows, sheep, goats, any of the other 100 and some odd species of ruminant.
Well, I'm excited to see your presentation, and we'll definitely chat more after the presentation. So take it away.
Thank you. It seems like a long time since Anna and I met in Omaha, way back in the BC time, which I guess it would help if I actually, nope, we're still recording. Before COVID. So in any case, here we are. Part of my message today is to let people know a bit of what I've spoken about in a lot of other venues, and you can find talks on YouTube and other places on the web. But I want to make people aware of just how important forage agriculture is, not just in the United States, but globally. And also why I say that we need a ruminant revolution. If we're going to meet the goals of today's world, let alone tomorrow's. And to just kind of declare my interests, if you will, I'm an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and ruminant animal agriculture. I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life, and I work for a forage seed company, but I'm not representing that company today. But just, kind of let you know the perspective that I bring to the conversation. Oh, by the way, if you don't know, the taste test is not part of hay judging, but I think many of the people will understand that already. My background and training, as I've already mentioned, is in those sciences to do with healthy soils and healthy plants and healthy ruminants. And then I had personal experience starting in 2007 that led me to get very interested in human nutrition. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. I mentioned the challenges that we have coming at us. We frequently hear about the world of 2050 when it's projected we'll have 9 billion people that we'll need to feed, which would be somewhere north of 2 billion more than we currently have. That would require an increase in food production by doubling, essentially, accompanied with an increase in demand for animal protein of 2/3. And of course, we've got to do that essentially from the same land area. And there's several nuances to that that we could talk about, but just to give a sense of what we must achieve over the coming, 30 years. And I just want people to understand that we can't feed today's world without ruminant animal agriculture, let alone this world of 2050 that's coming at us. In order to meet these goals, we have to increase the efficiency and productivity of ruminant animal agriculture, not just in North America, but globally. And there's several things that we could talk about. But I get to stand in front of a lot of audiences that need to be informed or taught what is a ruminant and what role did they play in our past as a species, why they are essential today, and how they'll enable a truly sustainable future as opposed to some of the narrative visions that are presently discussed. So briefly, we've got these 134 species of ruminant animals today. And it's kind of remarkable that the majority of the animals that we've domesticated are herbivores, and the biggest part of that obviously are ruminants. Um, these animals, we've been able to domesticate them in every biome that we've successfully colonized, or at least managed them in some way. But it's important to understand that these animals are not competitive with humans for food resources. In fact, they increase the food supply and they improve food quality of that supply. And they also provide some additional services. Ruminants are absolutely essential, and people talk about as if we could get rid of them, and there is no functional replacement for them. Primarily, they are critical for the conversion of structural and non-structural carbohydrates into fat. They convert plant protein, and notice that I put quotes around that, into highest quality animal protein. I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. They reduce the unstable polyunsaturated fatty acids into the more stable monounsaturated and stable saturated fatty acids through a process called biohydrogenation. They produce vitamin B12 and other vitamins. They increase the bioavailability of essential minerals over those same minerals provided from plant sources. They degrade the anti-quality plant components that we frequently suffer from in various plant source foods. They maintain the health of grassland ecosystems, which ought to be of concern to people in Nebraska, considering that you're basically in the major grassland area of North America. They recycle nutrients and build soil health. They provide services like draft and byproducts. They generate new wealth. All these are essential. This, simply put, we didn't evolve to eat meat. We evolved because we ate meat. All of the ruminants were in place something like 20 million years ago. The hominid ancestor was what, 3 million years ago, something like that, and the modern Homo sapiens date back a couple 100,000 years. So it's pretty clear that the ruminants provided the resources that our ancestors exploited. And there's a whole lot of very interesting information that we could get into if we had the time. But the idea that our ancient ancestors were vegetarians is just a complete myth. And bringing it forward into today, the notion that raising livestock and consuming animal source food is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development is flawed. This is a wonderful paper. I recommend it highly. Adeshogan's paper from last year, Animal Source Foods, Sustainability Problem or Malnutrition and Sustainability Solution. Perspective Matters. And he's writing from the perspective of someone who came from Africa. He's now a faculty member in the United States, and they're engaged in research to improve livestock system efficiency in Africa, Southwest Asia, and other parts of the developing world. or I guess the proper term is the low and middle income countries of the world. And here in the affluent or high income country of United States, it's easy to forget that it hasn't been that long since we were dependent on draft animals. And it's kind of entertaining to think about a draft moose or a saddle elk, although I think there's a safety issue with the elk there. I'm not sure I'd want to be that close to all those pointy things. But this was 100 years ago, but still today, 50% of the world's farmers are dependent on draft animals. And different parts of the world, the numbers are different, but without those livestock, we wouldn't have the food systems that we have today, let alone the ones we'd like to have in the future. And without livestock, there are some other impacts. We've got nearly 1 billion people in the world that don't have access to electricity. I think the figure that I saw recently was 45% of humanity consumes less electrical power in a year than the average North American refrigerator, which means nothing else that we're taking for granted, including access to technology like we're using to communicate and learn from today, is available to these people. They don't have it. And so if we're going to move forward into the world we'd like to see, we have to overcome those kinds of limitations. In this case, specifically 3 billion people in the world today rely on burning dirty biomass fuels, which includes dung. In this case, we have a woman with a tray of animal manure, and the pats you can see on the building behind her are drying so that they can burn that for fuel. Well, the European settlers moving across Nebraska once upon a time collected the dried pats so that they could burn them, but we've been allowed to progress beyond that. One thing to keep in mind is when you burn that fuel, you lose the nutritive value of it as a manure. And it turns out that the majority of fertilizer used in our cropping systems comes from manure. Even looking at Europe, where we're clearly looking at a high-income country, but more than a third of the nitrogen inputs in their cropping systems are coming from manure. So if people are entertaining this narrative of eliminating livestock agriculture, where is the fertilizer going to come from to produce the crops that they think we need, we can survive on alone? I think the figure is something like 60% of the world's fertilizer ends up coming from manure. So one of my messages is that ruminant animal agriculture is the truly sustainable agriculture. If it is not, then we don't have one. And that I want people to understand that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. It is completely reasonable for people to want to improve the world. But I don't think people recognize the impact that chronic disease, which is primarily metabolic disease, has from an environmental sense. And that if we could get more people to improve their health, that would enable perhaps the most practical means of improving the world. Today, non-communicable diseases are the biggest cause of death globally. Many people say that if we could stop feeding livestock, we'd have all this feed available to feed humans. And it's important for people to recognize that globally, the ruminant animal herd, less than 96%, or sorry, put it another way, less than 5% of the feed that goes into the global ruminant herd is human edible. Now, basically, that's the grains and the soy cakes at the top of this graph. And to get to less than 5% edible, it's important to recognize that a quarter of those grains are not human edible. There's lots of reasons that a grain which might otherwise be edible is no longer considered human edible, grade issues and things like that. That's before we ever get to whether they should be eaten. But in this case, we're looking at 10% of the global cereal production going into the global ruminant herd. So if you were to get rid of this, it's not like you'd have this vast amount of feed available to convert into human food. And it's also important to recognize that when we feed those human edible proteins, in this case, to ruminants and convert them into meat and dairy, we increase the food value of those. And so we not only increase the protein supply, we improve its quality by feeding, by managing ruminant animals globally. And it's important to recognize that the alternatives, which would be produced under crop systems, have an environmental impact all their own. And one of their biggest impacts is soil degradation, either the loss of soil structure and or the loss of soil itself through erosion. And this idea that this is a resource that really isn't replaceable. Once we lose it, we lose it. And we can't eat the raw rock. We are entirely dependent on having healthy soils. And having ruminant animal agriculture systems allows us to use things like long-term rotations in perennial grasses, for example, which protect the soil from erosion and improve soil structure and quality. It's also important to have a more global view of the conversation. And frankly, we live in a world where a significant number of our brothers and sisters live where an egg a day would grow a better human brain. Something like a quarter of children 5 and under in the world today suffer from stunting. And this isn't just physical stature, this is cognitive development and brain development. And this stunting that occurs in childhood will last the rest of that person's life. And in fact, stunted mothers are more likely to have stunted children. Out of the 7 billion people in the world today, 2 billion suffer from micronutrient malnutrition. Basically, this is due to a lack of access, the lack of consumption of animal source food, period. So despite the narratives, there is such a thing as too little animal source food in the diet, and we see it. It's happening. I would suggest that the preponderance of evidence from all scientific disciplines strongly suggests that the most likely harm associated with meat consumption is from not consuming enough. I know that some people might argue, and I know that we need to have a fuller conversation, but we have evidence of the harm from too little. Where is the evidence of harm from too much? In any case, I'd like to move us all past the diet arguments, the diet wars, the us and them. I think people of goodwill ought to be able to agree on two things. One is that we need to focus on achieving adequate essential nutrition. And second, the importance of maintaining or restoring metabolic health. Now, I understand that there are going to be further conversations about both of those, but let's at least start there. And if we can't agree on those, then probably we shouldn't go any further, because we may very well not be dealing. We need to sort out some arguments before we go any further, I guess, is the easiest way to put that. So people should then, based on that information, choose accordingly based on their preferences, their situation, their responses. But I'd like to build bridges. And one of the bridges I think we desperately need to build is between the producers and the consumers, because I think we're interested in the same things. I think, to quote Amanda Radke, that consumers and producers alike care about animal welfare, environmental stewardship, food safety, nutrition, taste. We could increase the list. I think it's likely that we'll have different perspectives informed by our different experiences. Can we please get together and start having conversations with each other? So my journey into this, the human health side of this, was fueled by my own personal experience. So starting in 2007, here's the Christmas picture where you set the camera up on the tripod and set the timer and run and get in the picture. And then when you look at the picture, you go, ooh, note the Hawaiian shirt, which is nice camouflage. And then 3 years later, I got to do it again. And this transformation was brought about by following a diet that was pretty much 180 degrees different than what we had been taught was the healthy diet by that time. And that was mostly following Protein Power Life Plan by Michael and Mary Dan Eads, as well as some other resources that were available. By that time, I had read Gary Taub's Good Calories, Bad Calories. And so the first thing that happened was I started to get mad, because I felt like the industries that I'd been taught to support had been slandered and unfairly accused. And I also then wanted to help people understand this information. And so 2010, I began showing up at various events. And since that time, I've gotten to talk to a number of audiences, including this one, to just try to build bridges between my agricultural tribe and my therapeutic carbohydrate reduction tribe. But what do you know? You're just a forage agronomist. Well, one of the things I've learned is that there's a fundamental difference between policy and science. The two aren't the same. In fact, in many ways, they're polar opposites. Policy, once it's set, has a tremendous inertia that fights against change. And in the case of the diet, we understand now that there really wasn't sound science to support it when it was instituted, and over the years there hasn't been any that's come up that says, oh, we were right after all. And let me just continue a little bit. As a forage agronomist and as a ruminant nutritionist, I understand that crude protein is not true protein. In fact, crude protein is nothing more than the total nitrogen percent of a sample multiplied by a conversion factor, 6.25. This is because the assumptions are that all the nitrogen that was in that sample was in protein, and all that protein was 16% nitrogen. Well, there's a few problems with that assumption. Some proteins contain more or less than 16% nitrogen. Different foodstuffs contain varying amounts of non-protein nitrogen. That's not a problem when we're feeding ruminants, because one of As I mentioned earlier, one of its ecological functions is, thanks to the rumen microorganisms, they can capture non-protein nitrogen, form microbial protein out of it, which the host ruminant then digests. It essentially grows a crop of microbes and then harvests them. So there's no such thing as an essential amino acid in a ruminant's diet, while there is in ours. And the difference between crude protein and true protein is greater in plant source foods than in animal source foods. And the true protein that comes from animal source foods contains a higher proportion of what we have called nutritionally essential amino acids. So I know this as a ruminant nutritionist. What surprised me is how few human nutritionists understand that. And the result is that for almost half a century now, swine nutritionists have had a greater appreciation for essential amino acids in the diets that they formulate than human nutritionists have. And we don't digest protein, we absorb amino acids. And there traditionally has been this idea that there are these essential ones, non-essential. They began to talk about conditionally essential. Sometimes under certain conditions, some of these become essential. But it turns out that really all of that is a bit of a misnomer, because just because we can make some amino acids doesn't mean we can make enough if they're not in our diet, if they're completely removed from our diet. It'd be very hard to do that. But if you're not consuming sufficient protein, you could enter into this territory. Well, we're told that we overeat protein. Well, depends on when and where. And it depends on a couple other factors as well. If we look at different regions of the world, or we look at global average and look from 1969 to 2013, and I forget how many million more people we've had in that time. I want to say we've doubled. I could be wrong on that, but we've increased the number of humans, and we've increased the daily protein supply for those humans. That's a good thing. In some regions, we've dramatically increased the protein from animal source foods, which would be the bottom portion of each of these bars. But globally, more of humanity's protein supply is still coming from plant source foods than from animal source foods. And it's important to recognize that this is crude protein supply. So we just talked about why that's important. And there's this thing called the recommended daily allowance, and people look at that and say, oh, look, there's the evidence that we're over consuming protein. Well, not so fast. Because basically, the short version is the RDA should be considered a minimum, not a target. Okay, so then a moderate amount of protein intake, and this aligns with what you might learn from, for example, dietdoctor.com, is now represented within that blue shaded bar, that box that I've just drawn. Okay, so now that looks very different. Basically, only in the Americas or in Europe or in what's termed Oceania, so that would be New Zealand, Australia, for example, do we see protein consumption falling in that region? Certainly not globally. But that's a moderate protein, so note that we've changed the scale now. There's such a thing as an acceptable macronutrient distribution range of 10 to 35% of calories. Now this yellow box would represent that range for a 70 kilogram individual with a 22,000, I think it was 2,300 calories that I used for this calculation. Note that the lower range is actually above the RDA in this case. We could even draw a tolerable upper limit at 3.5 grams per kilogram body weight, which would even be above that. We shouldn't talk about protein intake in terms of percent of calories when we're feeding human beings. Human beings need an amount of high quality protein per day, and the amount of calories can fluctuate, but that amount of protein should not. And again, we're still looking at the plant source protein as if it's an equivalent on a gram for gram basis with the animal source protein. Oh, and by the way, there's a group called Eat Lancet. Yeah, get ready to hear from them again. We heard a lot from them about a year ago. They're back. This is their global diet that they would suggest that people eat only 1.5 ounces of meat per day. Yeah, I don't think so. Today, the reality is humanity, more of our global protein supply comes from cereals than from all animal source foods. And cereals are a really poor source of protein nutrition. They are. It's just a function of them. And yet, for the poorest 20% of the tropical population around the world, rice provides more protein per person than beans, meat, or milk. And it's low quality protein. And we'll talk about that here in just a bit. You can see clear evidence of the relationship between meat consumption and stunting, where the lower the meat consumption, the greater the rate of stunting. And where Eat Lancet would like us to be is down in the high stunting range, actually at a level of consumption equivalent to Haiti. Probably not, thank you. But it's not just in the low and middle income countries that this is an issue of protein consumption. Over 40% of Americans don't get enough. Most females over the age of 8 aren't getting enough. And this is even worse because this is based on RDA, number one. We've just seen that that's a target. It's a basement, not a target. And also this is considering plant and animal source protein as if they're equivalent, and they're not. And there's another little factor in here that I've recently stumbled across, and that's the variability of protein content, even in something like soybeans. So here's some values out of a sample set of almost 6,000 soybeans. And you can see that the crude protein value ranged from 29.5 to over 46.5%. With the average being 39%, book value that's frequently presented. And that's what people use for creating labels or creating whatever. But clearly that's going to vary quite a bit. And we don't get that with the animal source foods. Animal source foods don't vary as anywhere near as much as the plant sources. And we can break it down into the individual amino acids. The yellow shaded ones are the ones that were considered essential. And you can see tremendous variability between those within that data set that was summarized in the previous slide. We could look at wheat. Remember that more of humanity's protein is supplied in cereals, and wheat is the highest crude protein cereal. 20% of humanity's protein supply comes from wheat. That's larger than any single animal source food. And wheat is a very poor quality protein source for feeding human beings. And as we get older, it gets marginally better, but it's still a low value protein source. And then when we process plant source foods, we can impact the digestibility of that amino acid composition. So in this case, we can see the dramatic reduction in the protein value of the cooked wheat cereal. It's interesting then when we look at animal source foods and we process them, we don't see that same reduction in nutritive value. And in some cases, we actually see something of an increase in its digestibility of the amino acids and the value of that in feeding human beings. So when we talk about processed animal source foods, when we talk about processed foods, we should not confuse animal source foods with plant source foods. That there's a fundamental difference that we need to keep in mind. And so far, I've only been talking about the value in terms of protein, but clearly all of these other nutrients come with, we don't just eat protein, we eat food. And that food comes with a number of nutrients. And in the case of animal source foods, they are nutrients that tend to be short in many people's diets. And if we would look at all these nutrients and fairly value their improved digestibility and nutritive value from the animal source versus the plant source, we could probably shift a lot of conversations. Just very briefly, I'm pretty certain we're not even talking about calories, right? In the case of sawdust, for example, it has a gross energy content of 4.4 kcal per gram on a 100% dry matter basis. So that 4.4, does that sound familiar? Kind of like how many calories are in a gram of carbohydrate or protein versus fat, right? We have that 4 versus 9. But the question is how much, what in animal nutrition, we're used to saying metabolizable energy, not gross energy. So how much of that is metabolizable? So in the case of ruminant nutrition, even though the gross energy content of both alfalfa hay and wheat straw are similar, we understand that there's a dramatic difference in metabolizable energy content between the two. I'm not certain, but what we're not even talking about the caloric content in human foodstuffs correctly. And in any case, the difference between gross energy and metabolizable energy is much lower in animal source food than is going to be in plant source food. So if we're just looking at calories on a gross energy calorie basis, we're going to be getting far more metabolizable energy out of animal source food than we're getting from plant source food. Yet how are we accounting for energy intake in food feeding studies, et cetera, et cetera? So this is something else for us to look at a little bit. So basically, when it comes to the consumption of animal source food, there is such a thing as too little. I'm asking the question, is there really such a thing as too much? What's the evidence upon which people base their belief that there is? More familiar perhaps with the papers that came out just recently last year in the Annals of Internal Medicine. My interpretation of these basically says if there's an upper limit, it's not at current levels of consumption. People want to look at environmental issues, and so very briefly, just to touch on a few of these, it's important for people to recognize that ruminant animals are not alchemists. They're not creating carbon or nitrogen out of nothing. They're cycling it. They're part of a natural cycle that's going to take place. It's also important to make sure that we're talking about, we're talking in correct units and correct data concerning the anthropogenic greenhouse gases that come from animal agriculture. If you look at EPA values, we're looking at something like 9% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the United States come from agriculture, 9%. Now, that's not all from animal agriculture. Animal agriculture represents less than half of that, 4% of the total US. And that's not all from beef. That's something like 2% comes from beef in the United States. So compare that to transportation, electricity, industry, commercial, residential. And if you look globally, that figure for livestock agriculture is like 14.5%. And that's not all from beef. So make sure that people are using the information appropriately. And even if we were to get rid of all animal agriculture in the United States, its impact on anthropogenic greenhouse gas reduction in the US, 2.6% of total, globally less than 0.4%. But it would come at the cost of unbalancing our food ecosystem and I would say exacerbation, the authors said creation of essential dietary nutrient deficiencies. But remember, we're not properly crediting the value, the nutritional value of the animal source food when we do these sorts of models. And when we do, we find that as it says, the production of protein containing animal foods would retain a much lower environmental impact than that previously estimated, lying approximately within the range of that of most foods of vegetal origin. But let's take it a step further. Let's look at the environmental impact of metabolic disease. We don't do that typically. And here's some figures that basically say that if the average type 2 diabetic in America could eliminate their medication use, they'd reduce their carbon footprint 29% more than if they switched from a meat heavy to a vegan diet. If there were only some way that a type 2 diabetic could eliminate their medication use, if there were only some way, what might it be? Oh, might look a lot like, for example, the VERDA effort and study. In this case, they're looking at data from, what was this? 1 year improvement, reduction of almost, well, over 50% plus or minus. In 1 year, they've just recently published 3-year data that shows this continued medication-free remission of type 2 diabetes. So we have a demonstration of a lifestyle dietary approach frequently utilizing more animal source food than the traditionally recommended healthy diet. And that has an environmental impact that we need to place on the scale against the environmental impact of raising the animal source food. And we haven't really done those models and studies yet. And I hope that I can help people do that. So getting a little snarky, both professions wear white coat, which produces more greenhouse gases. Well, if we were just to look at the beef industry alone, that's 2%. If we look at the US healthcare system, that's 10%. Maybe another way to look at it, and I'm indebted to Sean Baker, who put this up first on Twitter, but both professions wear white coats, which is better for your health. It might be time for us to relearn in human husbandry what we've known in animal husbandry for quite some time, and that is animal husbandry begins with proper animal nutrition. So a quick review: humans must consume other organisms. We can't photosynthesize, we can't eat raw rock. Animal products are superior sources of nutrition in the human diet. Ruminant animal agriculture offers unique ecological advantages over other forms of food production. There can be no sustainable agriculture without ruminants. Ruminants do not compete with human beings for resources. Ruminants increase the quality and quantity of humanity's food supply by improving the protein quality, by reducing the polyunsaturated fatty acids to forms that are not harmful. They increase the mineral bioavailability over the plant source foods, even those that are human edible, and they provide essential nutrients unavailable from plant source foods. Modern humans exist because of ruminants. Modern societies depend upon them, and they will be essential to the future of humanity. And the estimates of ruminant animal agriculture's environmental impacts are typically overstated, oversimplified, and frequently misleading. Important for me to mention sometime along here that I'm not a human medical doctor. I'm not that kind of doctor, so I'm not giving medical advice, but I'm more than happy to help people find medical doctors, medical information. I'm happy to help people find research information to help them make informed decisions about their own health. And I would like to just pose the question to my agricultural tribe: what would be the impacts of more consumers coming to understand that red meat is in fact a health food, not a health hazard? And it's important for us to recognize that a tipping point is not 51%. Tipping point might be 18%. If you get enough people to understand this, then we would see a rapid transformation in the rest of society. So you can find me at various locations. I'm sure that these links will be posted somewhere, but you can find me on YouTube, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, find me on Facebook, or you can email me at peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com. So with that, I'm done, and I promised 20 minutes, and I'm absolutely certain I've taken far more time than that, but I couldn't cut it down any further. So with that, we'll just call it good.
That was fabulous. I can't even tell you. I mean, I just love what you do, because it reminds me of like the whole thing, like you can throw a pebble into the water, right? But it's going to have a lot of ripples. It's not just one little thing. And we always want it to just be so simple and tidy and one little thing. And everything we do, we're like one big ecosystem. Our bodies, the grassland, the sun, the atmosphere, water, all of it, you know, what we put in our mouths. So anyway, I love that you call it therapeutic carb reduction. And I do want to ask you this, or just point this out. A lot of our neurotransmitters, you talked about brain health and people, you know, being stunted mentally from a lack of protein. A lot of our neurotransmitters are dependent upon amino acids that we eat. Like serotonin is dependent on basically on tryptophan, if I'm not mistaken. And so if you don't get enough of that, and we have a plethora of doctors prescribing SSRIs now, right? To help people uptake serotonin. Well, it could be that you're not eating enough meat. to access
Mhm.
the proper level that you need to thrive. And I think that that's a really good point that you made too, is that the RDA recommends minimum, and it's based on nitrogen, isn't it? The protein intake, but
The,
they're just basing it just like on nitrogen and not the quality or what happens to that nitrogen in your body. So they're lumping plant proteins and animal proteins together, correct?
yes, and they're also setting that for like half the population. So it's a target for half the population to be in nitrogen balance, I think is the technical definition. Well, we know that our protein needs vary. For example, if we're trying to fight off an infection, or if we're as we age, we now know that we need to be consuming more. So one of the stories is that right now it's basically 18 and above, everybody needs that same target, except that now we know that once you get up into your late 50s or early to mid 60s, you need to be eating more. And the good news is we have that tremendous range of safety well above where a lot of people think, oh no, that don't get above that. And it's no, there's no evidence for us to be concerned.
I also liked that you mentioned your personal N=1 experiment, because I feel like, what have you got to lose to
Mm.
try something different? I myself have 4 autoimmune diseases, and you talked about immune health and immunity with, or I've heard you on a lot of podcasts talking about that, that meat helps you to have a good immune system. And now here I am, I'm half of the time I'm off of my Humira at this point,
Mm.
and I eat more meat than most men I know, because I am carnivore. I eat
Mhm.
pretty much solely animal products. I'll have a pickle, maybe some mustard, every once
Mhm.
in a while, a little pesto thrown on some shrimp, but really not much. And I'm going to be 55, and my skin has never looked better, and I've
Mhm.
honestly never felt better. And that N=1 has given me that information for
Mhm.
myself.
Yeah, we need to, I think people should feel comfortable. As you say, what do you have to lose? And right now, unfortunately, too many people think, oh, if I eat that much meat, it's going to, and then, melt your bones, give you cancer, the saturated fat's going to clog your arteries, whatever. And it's important for people to understand all of that is myth. None of that is true. And people are concerned about any number of things, which if we could have the time and walk them through, we could say, no, none of that is important. What is important is that if you are part of the almost 90% of adult Americans who don't enjoy optimal metabolic health, there are concrete things that you can do now that will have that could have a very rapid effect on that condition. And that condition alone is a major risk factor for all of these non-communicable diseases that people are so concerned about.
Not to mention the savings. I
Mm,
I have had clients get off of not even a large amount of insulin, that they were just using a little bit of insulin each day, save $300 a month after
mm,
working with me for a week and a half. And I just
mm,
tell them, get rid of the simple sugar in the beginning and eat a good full protein animal fat breakfast. I just
mm.
start there and no snacking. And bam, in a week, sometimes some of them are off of their insulin, you
Yeah,
know. And I have them work with their doctor. Like, I won't work with them if they won't tell their doctor, this is what I'm doing and I need your help.
yeah, yeah,
That I'm,
yeah.
but my husband is, and he's a cardiologist. And I
Mhm,
had my blood work used to be that my total cholesterol was under 200, but my triglycerides were super high and my HDLs were super low. Now my total cholesterol, last time I had it done, was about 280, I think, and
mm.
my HDLs are so high, they're like 90 or something, and my triglycerides are super low, and my LDLs are high. But I I have very good blood sugar. My
Mhm.
A1C is good. I don't have high blood pressure, so he's not worried about it. He like almost teared up, and he was like, "This is beautiful, babe." Because
Yeah,
see,
yeah,
LDLs they're different. You know, they're each one is different, and there's part of these LDLs are going to be worse if you're metabolically unhealthy. So it's really
yeah.
that I'm not going to have metabolically unhealthy LDLs.
Indeed. For people involved in livestock agriculture, imagine it's hard for us to imagine just how poor the metrics of human health are that we've been, driving public health messaging and everything against. And so that's part of it. One of the points that I sometimes make is human human nutrition and human medicine can't answer the same questions that animal nutritionists and veterinarians can.
Right.
And that's not a bad thing. It's an ethical issue, and
Yeah.
and and it's not to say that there aren't ethical issues in animal research. There very much are, and that's a good thing. Just like, there's a difference between animal welfare and animal rights, and unfortunately, people don't frequently understand that. And when I have a chance to talk to them, they mean animal welfare, but they say animal rights, and they're very, very, very different things. But you, I was giving a presentation at a forage conference, and I had Adele Height in the audience because she was on the program, and she. So I'm talking about how, when we do plant nutrition work, we can get seed from the same lot of seed, and we can get a uniform plot of land and lay out our experimental design and apply precisely measured amounts of fertilizer, or we can even move it in a greenhouse and control the environment and all of those things. And or when we get to animals, we can get genetically similar groups of animals who can manage them in controlled, but there's a little less control. I said it's really hard to find large groups of genetically similar human beings that we can precisely control for extended periods of time and know exactly what we fed them and what its nutritive value was, and know exactly what they didn't eat and what its nutritive value was. And Adele spoke up loudly enough to be heard and said, and sacrifice them at the end of the study to determine body composition. We can't do, but yet we do have animal models for things like swine nutrition, which could inform us if we could get away from this nonsense of nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease, which is just a failed exercise. And yet it's the foundation of what many people think they know about human nutrition. And it's really unfortunate.
It's super unfortunate because people think there are a million superfoods, for one thing. Like the green smoothie thing. Thank you, Dr. Oz. Women have had oxalate poisoning from drinking too much kale and spinach, because again, the pebble, right? Let's look at all the rings that are coming out of that pebble being thrown into the water. But we just look at, oh, it appears that people that eat more greens are healthier, so now let's OD on greens, right? And so, I mean, all of these things, like my clients are constantly like, blueberries are a superfood and this and that. No, there's liver is a superfood. Beef
Yeah.
liver is a superfood.
Well, and what does that mean anyway? Superfood. What? How about you just feed the organism properly, and
Right.
these issues resolve? So
And you
I
call
call
that species appropriate diet. And I love that.
exactly.
It's SAD, standard American diet,
Yeah.
SAD, species appropriate diet.
There you
And
go. Thank you.
we literally do not have the cecum of a cow, and we do not have 7 stomachs. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like our cecum is like around like this big, right?
Well, yeah, if it's not inflamed. So no, we have, there were slides that left the presentation. A ruminant has, quote, 4 stomachs. They actually, it's more like 3, but if you imagine the human digestive system with a gastric stomach, as acidic stomach, and put in front of it the apparatus necessary to ferment plant matter, that's a ruminant. And that, so you have the reticulorumen that's entirely guided, dedicated to the reduction of the physical size of the plant matter that it eats. So it does that through the process of rechewing. It also then has this enormous microbial population that is responsible for breaking down cellulose, this carbohydrate that's made up of lots of glucose units, but they're linked in a way that no vertebrate animal can access that energy. But the microbes produce cellulase, and that then liberates that energy that can support microbial growth, as well as the production of these volatile fatty acids, which the host animal then absorbs. So the cow eats a diet that's somewhere around 5% crude fat total, and ends up where 70 to 80% of its energy comes from the volatile fatty acids that were produced in microbial fermentation. So that's how those mammals can survive on a low-fat diet. Other mammals have different digestive systems and therefore different dietary requirements. And so in a ruminant's diet, there's no such thing as an essential amino acid. We talked about that. There are essential amino acids, quote unquote, in our diet. There is no such thing as an essential fatty acid, apparently, in a ruminant's diet, but there are in ours. And there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate in a human's diet. But there are 2 forms of essential carbohydrate in a ruminant's diet. They need both the structural, the fiber carbohydrates, as well as the non-structural, the sugars and starches and things that come with plants, in order for the rumen to function properly. And it's a matter of balance to get things right for them. So you have this very nice ecological fit between the ruminants and then all of these animals that were dependent, the carnivores. And then we came along and found a niche in the grasslands that we could exploit. And then we end up with a brain sufficient to allow us to domesticate these animals and manage our environment to a degree that no other animal has been able to do. So not only are the amino acids essential for brain health, but those long chain fatty acids are essential. And our ability to convert from the plant source to the animal source can be severely limited depending on a number of factors. A similar thing might be the B12 that chimpanzees can still absorb from their gut that we can't. Mm-hmm. And so somewhere along the line, that mutation should have been fatal to us, except that we were already eating a diet that was rich in B12. And so we no longer had to depend on the microbial production of B12 in our large intestine. So I guess the last point to make on that, and it does get back to your question, is that large digestive apparatus has a large metabolic cost. It takes a lot of energy to maintain, the forestomachs and whatever else, or the larger intestine in primates than we have proportionately. And so as we exploited a diet higher and higher in animal source food, therefore higher in energy, therefore higher in these nutrients, more energy dense or nutritive dense, if you will, we didn't need the larger digestive system that the other primates still need. And so that could be exchanged and utilized to support the larger brain proportionately that we were developing. So all of those put together point to why it's not surprising that we have a significant portion of humanity that's suffering this impact of too little animal source food. I think one of the figures that I saw was that the impact of stunting could be equivalent to 11% GDP in sub-Saharan Africa as a drag on their development.
Well, there's been recent reports that American children are losing brain size by grams, in the past like 40 years, that the children's brains have been shrinking. And that's kind of commiserate with how we changed our diet to higher carbs, to, the recommended 60% of our dietary intake based on a 2,000 calorie diet, to have more carbohydrates in our food. And, speaking of fatty acids and cholesterol, people are so worried about eating high cholesterol food. Eggs are in and out of fashion. My sister used to nickname them cholesterol balls back when we were supposed to fear that. And now, this morning I had 5 farm fresh eggs. That was my breakfast, in some butter with a little bit of sausage, and I probably won't eat again until late this evening. So
sure.
But the thing about cholesterol that I think is interesting is animal fat is proving to be harmless. In fact, JAMA just came out with an article. Oh yeah, DIAAS. What does that stand for?
So DIAS, the digestible indispensable amino acid score.
Okay.
And it's an attempt to get an improved measure or estimate of amino acid digestibility, and so that you can compare on a more scientific basis different protein sources, or look at the entire diet. And there's some good papers to describe it. There were some global efforts to come up with this. I think they go back to 2005 now, or 2003. Basically, it was agreed. Everyone's known of the limitations of previous systems. It's just that we have one, it's difficult to get the information. Number two is we have all this old information, and so it takes a while to get past it. One of the techniques for developing this new estimate is to actually utilize ileal cannulated pigs. So put a port into the junction between the small and large intestine, and you quantify what goes in, and then you sample what comes out of the port, and you then don't have contamination from microbial activity in the large intestine. And you're then able to get an estimate of not just how much, in the case of, how much lysine, for example, is there, but how digestible is it?
Right.
And so, when you see a DIAS go from about 50 for wheat raw to 20 cooked, that lysine hasn't changed in quantity, but its digestibility has. And so this now gives us a window into some of these. It's also important, I think, for us to recognize a lot of the protein recommendations. It's somewhere along the line, it's like they were almost always talking about high quality protein.
Right.
So, it's like 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. Well, it's ideal body weight or whatever it is, but it's high quality protein, which you can translate into animal source protein.
Which you basically said 1.6 per kilogram is kind of like, that's where we're getting into being like at a proper protein
Yeah,
range.
I think dietdoctor.com just recently, was talking about 1.2 to 1.7
Right.
um, grams per kilogram. I think they were also talking ideal body weight. I also the sources that I cited in the slides talked about body weight.
Right.
So you can find differences. I've run across or communicated with some researchers say, who knows what their ideal body weight is? Where does that? But the point is that we've got such a range
Yes.
that if you if you aim for, let's just say 1.5 grams of high quality protein per kilogram of body weight and convert that to, however many for pound, I'm sorry. Or even, if you said 2.2 per kilogram,
Right.
so a gram per pound.
Yes.
Okay, so you're going to be in a safe range of intake, and you probably are going to have a hard time eating that much.
Yes. It's difficult to eat a lot of protein. It's so satiating.
And as long as you're eating it with the fat that naturally comes with it. So, you know, Dr. Lehman did a lot of work. I think he was talking about leucine, and getting sufficient leucine in a bolus. But the end result was you needed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 grams of high quality protein per meal. And he was talking about 3 meals a day. Well, I don't, whatever, that's what he was looking at. So apparently, if I'm remembering what he said properly, you need that much in order to trigger protein synthesis. That a lot of these systems are lysine sensitive. So our amino acids end up being signaling compounds. And
Yes.
so, okay, if that's the case, then make sure that whatever your first meal of the day is as you described it. So, to get to 30 plus grams, I mean, 4 eggs would only be 20, well, not only, 4 eggs would be 28 grams. And so add some cheese, add some meat, and now we're up into what you need in order to have sufficient amount. 4 ounces of cooked meat would be that same 28 grams. And so make sure that you're more than that, not the, whatever the healthy, no, stop. So those are kinds of targets. And that I think aligns pretty well with the EADS's protein power life plan, which is what I got started on many moons ago. So you need a specific amount, and you should get that at each meal, and that ought to be the first thing on your plate.
Yes. And it should be the first thing you eat, because that triggers the acid in your stomach to work harder and digest what you're eating. And that's where a lot of the breakdown of the animal proteins occurs, is right in your stomach.
Oh, yes.
I have
Yeah.
literally seen, I had a client who had severe Crohn's, a very young man, maybe 18, 19 years old. And he had a lot of his intestine removed, and he was just sick all the time and losing weight. And I asked him to just try carnivore for just a couple of weeks, and he started gaining weight. He stopped feeling sick, and he loves his junk food. So I think he went right back to eating the way that he was eating, but he's got a tool now,
Yeah.
to use. And as he matures, I think he'll see that, wow, why do I want to keep putting my hand back on the open flame? You know, his body will
Yeah.
give him information.
Yeah. I mean, I I think that we've got a sick population. What they should eat to what they will need to eat to get better is a different thing than what a healthy person could eat. And so we I think Adele taught me that we have a very limited knowledge of what to eat to not get sick.
Yes.
I mean, people say things, but that gets us back to nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease.
Although I do think it's safe to say remove overly processed foods. Don't eat things that aren't natural for the most part.
Well, bacon isn't natural.
Well,
Salami, cheese isn't natural.
yes, it's processed. You're right. I'll
Yeah.
give you that. I'm talking
So,
about if it comes with a box and a label that has, so many ingredients and you don't even know what you're eating. You just
yeah,
remove
no,
that stuff and you remove sugar. And it's a conspiracy. They have like 70 different names for sweeteners.
well, indeed. And again, my point of processed animal products are not the same thing as processed plant products. And so we all need to get more aware of some of the things. And I just like to every once in a while tweak and say, well, what about, what, because I remember I had this one occasion there's a German deli up in Portland, and I used to, when I was traveling way long ago, if I was coming home during business hours, I would try to stop. So I have a shopping list. Don't send me there without a shopping list. And the whole back wall of this place is just the meat case.
Yeah.
And almost everything they cure and manufacture in-house. And it's my happy place. And I'm standing there and waiting my turn, just, kind of, and this lady standing next to me is like, oh, it's all so good. And I said, yes, it is. And she said, it's a shame it's so bad for you. And I assumed that she was thinking about, saturated fat or nitrate or whatever. And so I started with the saturated fat, saying, you don't need to worry about that. She goes, oh, I know that. I said, well, what do you think? What do you think it's unhealthy? She goes, oh, it's also processed. And it's like, okay. So that's kind of what's behind my, let's make sure. And also let's think about now, I got to visit Brazil 2 years ago, and let's think about shelf-stable animal source food versus shelf-stable plant source food. Everybody thinks about Brazil as, the steakhouse and the barbecue, and it's all wonderful and it's all very good. But I can assure you that there's a lot of carbohydrate intake, and their rate of obesity is now similar to ours in a relatively short time. And they cook a lot in soybean oil, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what sorts of things could you put into the hands of a population that's struggling to have access and affordability? And also just talking to, perhaps it's come up in the people that you work with that, oh, I've got to buy grass-fed, ribeyes. It's like, no, you don't. You can go buy. Yeah.
I don't care, let's just get to eating good meat. And here in Nebraska, everyone knows everybody in central Nebraska anyway, knows someone who has cattle that you can split a quarter beef, a half a beef. Yeah. I'm picking up 84 pounds of 100% grass-fed, grass-finished bison tomorrow from the Straight Arrow Bison Ranch, and they have on-site kill, Peter. Mm-hmm. And it's like $8 a pound. And you talked about how important grass is for us to, like, the soil. And I think here we had the Dust Bowl. I have a 105-year-old aunt. So, she's
Mhm.
World War One. She remembers her mom saying the boys are coming home.
Mm.
The flu, she lived through that first bad flu. She lived through the Depression, but she said the Dust Bowl was worse than anything because she said we were poor already, but now we
Mm.
couldn't grow our food.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so grassland is so valuable. And I wanted to ask you, what happens when a cow, chews on that grass, and then as that grass is growing back, because I believe I heard it from you in Omaha, as the grass is growing back, it's literally pulling more carbon from the air than an acre of rainforest compared to an acre of grass. Is that about right?
Yeah, it depends. There are, well, so first of all, what happens? You have a grass plant. It's roughly speaking equal amounts of dry matter above ground and below ground. So you come along and you graze all but 4 inches in one grazing, whatever that amount was removed. Now the plant has to regenerate that the solar panels. It will primarily do that with energy that was stored in the stem base, not in the roots. Alfalfa goes to the roots, but grass is stem base, so it's still above ground. You've got all this fibrous root system that the grass had, but it doesn't need all that and can't support it. That's again a metabolic sink. So a certain amount of that root mass can be let go by the plant. So there's some organic matter now that's no longer being maintained. And then as the grass plant regrows, it's going to regrow root matter, which is fixed CO2 going down into the soil. So this is how, and then you also have an area that's under increasing study, which is the relationship between in what they call the rhizosphere, that area of the soil around the roots, and fairly close association. So you have compounds that the plant is producing that are, I'd say, leaking, but that may not be accurate. They may be actually exuding those intentionally. Intentionally, it's a plant. And then that's feeding the microbial population that's living. You also have fungi that are infecting the roots and forming a symbiotic, a mutually beneficial relationship that increases essentially the surface area that plant can exploit. So these fungi help with nutrient uptake. So all that's going on. The cycle is basically, you have CO2 from the atmosphere being reduced into carbohydrate through the process of photosynthesis,
Wow.
which also produces oxygen as a byproduct. Now, some portion of that carbohydrate is going to be eaten by the cow, but not all of it. And then you're going to have some portion of that ingested carbohydrate being burped out as methane, but not all of it.
Right.
So some portion, okay. And then once that methane is back in the atmosphere or is in the atmosphere, then it gets oxidized back to CO2 within 10 years. So it's essentially just a cycling of CO2 as opposed to those food production systems that are more dependent on the burning of fossil fuels, like crop farming, which
Right.
represents an increase in CO2 because we're burning hydrocarbons. There are differences. You've got obviously the difference between above ground carbon in a rainforest and a grassland, vastly different. But in the roots, it's the other way different. So in the soils in grasslands, you have a much larger carbon storage than you do in those highly weathered tropical soils. And
That's so
in
interesting. It
in
almost
some,
sounds like a Krebs cycle, you know?
well, it all is. I mean, that's where all life is going to be obtaining energy from. It's just, what units are they starting with to feed it?
Right.
So yeah.
I think that's just fascinating. And I love that because, we have the sandhills, which are an ecosystem that is unlike any other ecosystem in the whole entire world.
Mm.
People come to the sandhills to study it, because it's all native prairie. The roots are super deep. It was not affected by the Dust Bowl,
Mm.
only places that used up their soil
Yeah.
and soil is in big trouble right now. And I know we could go on and on. So I
Mm.
could talk to you all day about this stuff, but we'll stop here because I'm going to tell you what, you can find Peter everywhere. And what is the name of your Facebook group? You're the sod father of the
I
Ruminati.
am yes. So there's a group called the Ruminati. There's also a Facebook page called Grass-Based Health, which is open. And then you can find me by name. You can also find me on Twitter at grass-based, one word.
And I do want to encourage you that if you're a rancher or somebody that lives in Nebraska and you have 4-H students, get a hold of this man to give a lecture or hook them up with that Ruminati Facebook group and make sure that they can go out in the world. Like he said in his lecture, what did you say? Like if we can get to 16% of the people, we can have a major change. And I really think our kids that are into agriculture in rural areas like Nebraska and Oklahoma and Texas and places like that are really a great place for your message to be shared.
Well,
So
thank you for the opportunity.
I appreciate everything you do. You're so much fun and just so knowledgeable. And I can tell you just have an insatiable curiosity, and I can't wait to hear what you find out next and what you let us know next. So thank you so much, Peter.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity and good health to everyone.